Hello, good evening, and welcome back to tonight's edition of Doc Talk. As you can see, Kitten is getting bigger, and she's a little bit rowdier than she was last week, and so she might try running off a little bit more. So this week, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about migraine headaches, because that's a very, very common topic. Thank you, Daisy. So anyway, migraines are something that's a little bit different than just a regular headache. Basically, people are very familiar with the term headache, and so sometimes when a coworker or a friend or a relative is having a migraine, they might think, oh, it's just a headache. Why don't they just take some aspirin and get over it? And the difference between a regular headache, which usually is a tension headache, sometimes just on one side, whoops, where are you going? Or in the back of the head, tension headaches have a tendency to be right in the occiput here. Sinus headaches tend to be right above the eyes or right behind the eyes, and sometimes over the cheeks as well. Those different kinds of headaches can be treated in similar ways sometimes, and sometimes they require different interventions. So if someone is having, for example, a sinus headache over here or here, especially if it's the springtime, or actually down here in Florida, allergies are usually it can be year-round because the trees blend with the grasses, blends with the weeds, which gets into the dust and such in the wintertime. And so if people are having a lot of pressure headaches in the front of the face, then oftentimes things like the nutty sinus rinse or allergy medications can be very helpful for taking care of the pain there, along with the usual things such as Tylenol, Motrin, aspirin. And Goody's headache powder, for example, is something that's very popular down here, which basically is powdered aspirin that gets into the system very quickly. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's your toy. So, other headaches. If you've got a headache in the back of the neck area, a lot of times people carry their stress in the neck muscles and the shoulders. And there she goes. And it can be very, very helpful to practice relaxation exercises that will help take care of tension in these areas as well. Sometimes people are able to use acupuncture, for example. There's other dry needling techniques. For example, in the practice that I'm currently at, the physical therapists that work with us have something called dry needling, where they take pressure points and they just kind of put some needle in there to break up the scar tissue, which helps with relieving the stress and tension headaches as well. So those are a little bit about some of the more common kinds of headaches, the everyday headache that people tend to get very commonly. And how are those different from migraine headaches? Well, migraines have a couple of key features that not every migraine happens to everybody the same way, but that are very common amongst different kinds of migraine headaches. Photophobia and phonophobia. And that is where bright lights, for example, make somebody very, very sensitive. So oftentimes when somebody's having a migraine, just having a little bit of light, sometimes when they're driving their car, for example, and if you've ever driven and you've seen the flash of light off of somebody's rear view mirror, and it's a very bright reflection of the sun, that can trigger a migraine for some sufferers and can be very painful for people who are having migraine. And phonophobia, that means that the sound is painful as well. And so even soft sounds sometimes are interpreted by the brain as pain, and can also be troublesome for the migraine sufferer as well. So those are two very common key features of migraine headaches. There's another feature of migraines which is important to know about as well, and that is whether or not there's an aura. Now, we're not talking mumbo-jumbo, whimsy things with an aura. Doesn't mean we're going to see a magenta or whatever. But what an aura means as far as migraine headaches are concerned, basically it's a sensation of having something happen prior to the headache starting. Would you mind getting Daisy? And basically, when this is happening ahead of the migraine, you can get like a jagged light, for example. It's a very common aura that happens before headache that maybe a few minutes to an hour before the headache starts, the person gets some sort of a weird visual disturbance on there. And so basically, when this is happening, they very soon often know a little bit later that a headache is about to start or is in the middle of starting. Thank you. And another thing that can happen too is sometimes instead of a visual disturbance, sometimes it could be a sensation, like a strange smell or a taste or a tingling. And it's important to notice if for your own headaches, if you happen to have migraine headaches, if you get an aura or not, partly because it's got different implications for things such as for women using birth control and such. And also stroke risk can be a little bit different as well. And so with the aura, it has to do a little bit with the dilation of or constriction of blood vessels in the brain. And so if my memory serves me right, the aura tends to have a little bit higher risk of a stroke as well. So we'll post those references after in case you want to check it out. Also, things that go along with migraines, sometimes not only do people get different sensations sometimes, or sometimes no sensation at all, just kind of hits them out of the blue, there also is a variation of migraine called an abdominal migraine. And this is a little bit more common in children. And that's where instead of feeling pain in the head, they get belly aches or nausea and sometimes other GI disturbances like diarrhea and such. And belly pain is a very common version of that. And so those are called abdominal migraines, and those are a little bit more common in the children as well. And there's other weird things that happen as well in the brain. I've seen patients occasionally with a type of ocular migraine where basically instead of getting a headache, they get all sorts of other similar symptoms to the migraine. For example, having a blinding white light or something that comes over and can be troublesome for it. And so migraine headache, basically, not only is it different from a regular headache in that sometimes the regular headache kind of medications like Motrin and Tylenol don't necessarily stop it right away, but also the other key features of migraine are that it tends to be pounding and it tends to last for a very long time, usually hours, sometimes days, and in rare cases, weeks. Those poor souls occasionally we've had to admit someone to the hospital in my residency days where we'd actually have them taken in for some very specialized migraine types of medications as well. So, speaking of migraine medications, one of the first things you can do for a migraine is, if you're having a headache, have a medication on hand or something else on hand that you can use right away. Because when you get an aura, or when you start to feel that headache coming on immediately, then that's the best time to make the pain go away. It's much easier to squish a mosquito than an elephant. And so if one waits until the pain is very big, then it's much, much harder to control. So at the very, very, very first sign or inkling that a headache is coming on, the idea is to take whatever medication you would use, for example, 800 Motrin, 1,000 Tylenol, one of those goody headache powders, or a prescribed medication, the triptans, Imitrex, those kinds of medications can be gotten from your physician, of course. And of course, any of the medications I mentioned, it's best to work with your primary care physician to find the best one for you. And to take it right away at the very first sign of the headache. And then usually most of the medications are listed so that you take them again at some later time if the headache doesn't go away. Also, if you're able to get away from bright things like screens and lie down and sleep in a quiet room, oftentimes just simply taking a break, lying down and trying to sleep can make a migraine go away as well. And that's one of the other usual features of a migraine, is that it tends to go away with exposure to a dark room and sleeping. And of course, in addition to some of the medications, I kind of like the kitchen remedy stuff as well. And there's some really interesting stuff put out by Dr. Greger at nutritionfacts.org. If you go there and you look up migraine headaches, you'll find a good article. And one of the studies was shown that 1/8 of a teaspoon of ginger powder, regular old grocery store ginger powder, worked as good as Imitrex in one of the studies. And so the idea is not to do a ginger challenge where you just, eat the ginger powder directly. I guess you could if you had capsules or something like that you put it into. But if you had the ginger in a tea format or some other way in which you mixed it with food or something handy to eat it, and then the idea is that within 20-30 minutes or so, the same as, or within an hour or two, the same as you'd expect with other medications, that the ginger worked as well as the leading headache medication that was challenged against. Another one is lavender oil. Now, this study was interesting. Normally, Dr. Greger doesn't really review oils very much. What he does is focus mainly on food stuff, but occasionally he runs across a really nice article which is useful, simple, and groundbreaking, as it were. And he found that an article on lavender oil, where what the people did was they put a couple drops right here on the upper lip area, and also they were sniffing some lavender scented stuff for a while, and they found that it worked as bad as well as the medications as well. So there's a lot of different varieties of ways in which people can do it. I found this at a store one time where it's like these little things where you can kind of wear a little oil thing. It's just a scent diffuser kind of stuff. Of course, these types of little gizmos and gadgets are available to anybody that wants to look for them out there. Whether or not something like that would necessarily stop a migraine, I don't have any proof on that. Just what the studies results are showing on there. And this weekend, I was reading through one of my family practice journals, and I found another tip for migraine sufferers as well. Basically, this study showed that when people had 3 milligrams of melatonin every evening, that it was also helpful for chronic migraine sufferers as well. So there's a few other kind of home remedy stuff out there. I think the Butterbur, for example, might be another one that was studied. I really don't have much on the other natural remedies besides ones that Dr. Greger has reviewed in nutritionfacts.org. But it's very important to know what your own symptoms are and what triggers your headaches. Things that are extremely common triggers for migraines include foods. Artificial sugars tend to be very common, as well as some of the additives that are found in meat products, nitrates, MSGs, and so forth. And so there are some really good lists of foods that commonly trigger headaches. One of the best that I found is Dr. Barnard's nutritionmd.org. If you look at the migraine headache article there's a whole list of common triggers. Other resources as well, uptodate.com has got a huge list of triggers, everything from perfumes and such. Lack of sleep can be a common trigger. Stress, very common trigger. And so you're looking at some of these very common lifestyle kinds of things, which is stuff that's very easy to play with, experiment with, and control as well. Alrighty, well, that's about all that I had for migraines tonight. This is a little bit more relaxed kitten version of medical topics. I might do another presentation at some other later date with more detailed information on stuff. But for right now, I'm just going to say good night. And no, that's not food. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week. Have a good week. Bye-bye.